3, 2, 1. We're off.
All right. Hello, welcome to Radio Corona, the show from MIT Technology Review about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Gideon Lichfield. I'm the editor-in-chief of MIT Technology Review. And our guest today is Nelson Mark, who is professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the North American editor of the Pacific Economic Review. Nelson, thank you very much for coming.
Great to be with you.
All right, so if you are watching us on Facebook or on YouTube, you can drop questions for Nelson into the comments box. We will pick them up there and I will channel them to him. Today we're going to be talking about the reopening of the US economy and what lessons China has for the US and about the economic consequences of COVID-19 on China, the US, and the rest of the world. So Nelson, let's start by talking about reopening. The White House is now trying to put together a plan for how to reopen the US, possibly starting as soon as May. Some of the individual states are also putting together some plans. I've seen at least from California, Texas, and a few others. China, of course, was earlier along in this pandemic. It has flattened the curve successfully, or so it seems. Last week, the people in Wuhan were let out of lockdown after 76 days. The economy is ticking back to life. So what are we seeing in China and what lessons does that hold from the US as it thinks about how to reopen?
Well, so some of the obvious things that they're doing in China, I think, are things that make a lot of sense and common sense. So one thing is that they're doing daily temperature checks on their employees, and they have that technology. So if you've ever traveled to China, then you know what I'm talking about. When you get off the plane and you'll have to walk through something that is like the metal detector in a department store for shoplifting, but you walk through this thing and it takes your temperature. And if you have an elevated temperature, all these uniformed people swarm down on you. So they have that. So they're taking daily temperature checks, and they've implemented quick quarantines on people who are suspected of having the virus. And the workers are equipped with personal protective equipment. So masks, everyone's wearing masks. People are wearing hair coverings, gloves, things of that sort.
This is everybody, anyone who's going to a workplace.
It seems that it's pretty widespread, yes. And then they're doing some low-tech things of putting up like cardboard barriers and dividers in areas where people are homemade cubicles, if you will. In restaurants, they put up these barriers in canteens and so forth. It's questionable how effective those things are, but it's an attempt. So I think, for us in the US, we are scientists and we need data. And so that means testing. And so in addition to the PPEs, I think, what we need to do is we need to develop a technology for working and living in an environment in the presence of the coronavirus. So many of the things that they did in China with the PPEs and so forth, I think that would probably be a good idea in the US. Masks, gloves, and so forth. Social distancing, I'm sure, is not going away. Actually, it would be great if OSHA would convene a panel of experts to give us guidance as to safe practices in the workplace. Because we can't stay shut down forever, but I think we need to develop a technology for living and working in the presence of the virus.
Do you happen to know how widespread testing is in China right now?
That is a good question. So I don't think we know. And so the Chinese government's not the most trustworthy institution. That we don't know. But we do know that that there's widespread testing in South Korea.
Right.
And South Korea is, and also in Taiwan. So South Korea and Taiwan are also two countries that that did a really good job in arresting the virus and flattening the curve, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. What has the impact on China been economically of the pandemic so far?
Oh yeah, it's been rough. So they had a virtual shutdown for a month, and so if literally you do shut down for a month, that's that's a loss of 8%. Mm-hmm. And so it's been pretty big. And now that they've reopened, what they found is that so there's two-way dependence, you know. So we've come, you know, it's been a shock to us how dependent we are on China through the supply chain, but they're also dependent on the rest of the world. So with everyone else slowing down, shut down, they don't have any business. So it's been pretty rough. So I looked at some of the forecasters have come up with China. It's all over the place. So some think that China's growth will be for 2020 will be around 2% positive. Others are forecasting as low as -6% negative.
Right. And last year, their growth was
in the range of 6 to 7%.
Right.
So
okay.
So
it could be a pretty severe slowdown.
Well, in a lot of ways. So China has never had negative growth since 1978, and for until around 5 years ago, they've consistently had an average growth rates of around 10%. And this is really important to them in that the contract that the Chinese Communist Party has made with the people since in the post-Mao era is, you know, you give up your political and personal freedoms, and we get to trample on human rights and all the rest in exchange for giving you the opportunity to get rich. Right. And so keeping the economy growing is sort of the linchpin for the Chinese Communist Party to stay in power.
What sort of stimulus has China been giving compared with the stimulus package here in the US, the $2 trillion bill that was passed last month?
I think it's fairly, I think it's much smaller. I think the way that China's funnels their stimulus packages are through the state-owned banks. But it's been much smaller. But also in terms of households and individuals, China's a nation of savers. Mm-hmm. So they have this buffer stock to help them through, whereas in the US, we're largely a country that runs on credit. Right.
Interesting. Okay, so in other words, China's more resilient in some senses to this kind of shock. They can absorb it to some degree.
Yeah, most households would be in a better shape than they are in the U.S. Although there are a lot of businesses that that may be vulnerable.
Right, because there are these statistics that are frightening for the U.S. Right, the proportion of households that can't scrape together $400 for an emergency. I think it's like 40% of U.S. households, something like that.
Right. Now, the other thing about China is that the government tends to favor the state-owned enterprises, and in most cases, they, if not outright bias against, they're indifferent towards private enterprises. So I would look for if there's a rescue package to be biased towards the state-owned enterprises.
Right. What about, do you want to talk at all about the rescue package here, the stimulus bill in the US? I mean, what do you think of it so far? What else do you think might be needed in order to support an economic recovery over the next few months?
Well, so I think the current package is really pretty inefficient in a lot of ways. It's giving money, you want to give the money to the people who need it. And so a couple of people have been talking about this. Glenn Hubbard's one of them, who suggested that what we should do is operate the rescue through businesses and through the banking system, because most businesses already have a relationship with their bank. So that structure is already in place. And so you make rescue emergency loans to the businesses with the proviso that they keep people on the payroll. Mm-hmm. And then that is protecting the people who really need it. What we really want to do is we don't want people to go hungry, and we don't want people to lose their shelter. So what happened in the global financial crisis, where the rescue went to the banks but not to the households, well, then people lost their houses, and that depreciated the housing stock. Not only that, when you lose your house, people are upset, so they're going to trash their houses, so that even compounds the problem. And then you have—
Right, because then the banks are left with worthless houses. Yes.
Right, and so they're all getting sold at at a fire sale. So those kinds of things. So if it went through the business sector through bank loans, then you're protecting the households that really need the rescue package. So and that system's already in place.
Here in the US, that system's already in place.
Here in the US, yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. Some people have been asking about universal basic income, whether that is something that the US needs now. This was obviously a topic during the election campaign. Andrew Yang made it part of his platform. But it feels like the talk about a universal basic income is kind of coming back in the wake of coronavirus. Do you have any views on that?
I think that's a terrifically good idea. So if I were the social planner, I wouldn't make it universal, because high-skilled workers don't really need the money. I don't need the money. It's the low-skilled workers that need the money. But I can understand that as a political calculus, that it would be easier to implement if it were universal. But the reason, here's the reason why I would be in favor of it. So this is going off a little bit off topic, but not really, because we do a lot of trade with China, and that's been in the news. So okay, so there's, let me just talk about the issue about international trade. So the way that economists think about international trade is, imagine that we're a self-sufficient economy, and then we open the economy to trade, and then we see what happens. So in that case, we know that the answer is within the United States, that high-skilled workers are going to win, and the industries that they work in are going to expand, and business is going to be great. And low-skilled workers, their industries are going to contract, they're going to be downsized, they're going to be laid off, and they're going to be hurt. This has been known for a couple hundred years. Now, how is it that we can sell a policy like that where we know that somebody's going to be hurt? And the trick that we use is to say that the people that are winning from trade are going to earn so much more money that they could compensate the people who are downsized, and then we'd still all be better off. And that's true. but the thing is that we never compensate the people that are downsized. So all the workers in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, that have been downsized from the manufacturing jobs, and then now they're in low wage working, low skilled people, they've never been compensated. So the universal basic income is a way of targeting, because the low wage, the low skilled people are the people that are most likely to have been displaced by trade. So it's trade, and Yang talked about automation and technology. That certainly is. So we think that about, in terms of job losses or downsizing of the low skilled, about 1/3 of that has come from trade, and about 2/3 from automation. So yeah,
Okay.
I think it's a terrifically good idea.
Right. All right. Let's talk a little bit about something that you, I think, touched on already, which is the interdependence of the US and China economically. And not just the US and China, but actually the whole world and China, because so much of manufacturing now, so many of our supply chains go through China. So there are two questions here. And I think the first is the one you already touched on, which is China is being hit by the loss of demand of the rest of the world, right? So what does that mean for the Chinese economy longer term? And second, do you think that we are likely to start becoming less dependent on Chinese supply chains, because in some sense, the economic shocks here are showing how fragile everything is, how this dependence on China makes economies fragile?
Good question. So yeah, I think if you leave it up to the market, to businesses, I would be doubtful that there would be a massive rethinking about the supply chain, because in business, it's cutthroat. Margins are, costs are everything, cutting costs. And as long as China remains a low cost producer, I don't think that firms are going to move away from that. So what we can learn from this, though, is that is from a national security point of view. So early on, when countries would stop their exports of masks and so forth. And so we've seen that. So we can learn from that experience and run the national stockpile in an intelligent way. Those kinds of things, I think. I'm skeptical that businesses will significantly reallocate the way that their supply chains are set up, but for ensuring against these big undiversifiable kinds of risks like the pandemic, that really is the role of a responsible government.
Okay, just as a reminder to anyone watching, you are watching MIT Technology Review's Radio Corona. I'm speaking to Nelson Mark of the University of Notre Dame, and you can drop questions for him into the comments on Facebook or YouTube, and we will pick them up and ask them to him. Here is another question that has come in from the audience, which is, are there any, do you see any particular technologies or industries that might do well out of this pandemic?
Grocery stores have shown in the last, since the pandemic started, increase in sales. It's about the one, so grocery stores, makers of the antiseptic wipes. I just checked, the stock of Clorox has done very well during this time. Those are sort of like the two bright spots in terms of consumer spending. But everything else, well, of course, the hospitality industry, that's done horribly. Autos, appliances, all those sorts of things, they're on hold. And given the great uncertainty in the future, big ticket items are not doing well.
Mhm. Right. I mean, obviously, teleconferencing. Some people are talking about AI and similar industries of automation that might be doing better as a result of there being more remote workers, more need for, more
Yes,
need for
absolutely.
automation.
That's right. So Amazon has done well. Zoom has been doing very well. I think the number of people that use Zoom increased by something like 20-fold since December.
Right. Based on what we're seeing so far, in other words, it seems like there is a move to start reopening the US economy in May, but unless we happen to find a cure or a vaccine in the next few, very soon, which it seems unlikely, we might be in for extended periods of social distancing over the next year or more. Do you think there is I don't know, how optimistic are you about the economic recovery in the US? Or put it another way, how bad do you think it's going to get before it starts to get better?
Yeah, it's so one segment that's been hurt with that, well, has been nearly completely shut down are restaurants. They and restaurants are the kind of businesses that there's the biggest turnover in restaurant businesses. It's supremely hard to make a living in the restaurant business, so because their margins are really pretty small. So with social distancing, let's say that they can only have a capacity for a half or a third as many customers as they used to have. That I don't know how they're going to be able to handle that. The other thing is, entertainment, sports, concerts, going to a movie at a theater. That is going to be, those are going to take a huge hit. So the theater business is going to downsize, and then as it's possible that everybody just we switch to a new normal where everybody just streams their movies.
Right.
So yeah.
Do you have any views on?
No, well, it's a big deal in terms of at Notre Dame. The football brings in about $100 million a year, and people here were worried about whether or not there'll be a football season. So that's just for us, but across the country, it's very big business.
Yeah. Do you have any views on whether the US or China is in some sense better placed to deal with this in terms of how they're structured economically? You already talked about the fact that Chinese households are more resilient than American households because they save more. But in terms of the degree of centralization of the economy, China's being more centralized, more dependent on state-owned enterprises, do you think that puts the Chinese economy perhaps in a better position to respond or to get out of this kind of economic shock that we're seeing now? Or do you have more faith in the more privatized, decentralized US model?
So the decentralized model works really well when in normal times, when times are like 2019 before this came on. The centralized model works better when we are hit with an undiversified risk like the pandemic. So this kind of plays into a broader issue of the trade-off between individuals and society. And so so when you're hit with an undiversifiable risk like the pandemic, what seems to work better is to have a centralized decision-making and coordination. because everybody's exposed. And so there's a trade-off, there's a balance against for individual freedoms and to what's good for society. And so in the decentralized system, there seems to be what you have trouble controlling are the externalities, and where people feel an infringement on their rights. So bluntly speaking, so in China, with the centralized decision making, and then what plays into this is also that which helps them. And by the way, this is I'm in no way endorsing the Chinese government and their violation of human rights and all the rest. Okay, but China being a Confucian society, most people there are more amenable to following orders from the government. And so when they have the shutdown, and they shut that, so yeah, there's some people that are trying to escape it and so forth, but for the most part, people obey the shutdown. And when they tell you you got to wear a mask out in public and you're not wearing it, and the police come and tell you to put on a mask, you put on a mask. But in the US, that doesn't work very well. But the centralized decision making that they have, and sort of their orientation more towards society, if you can believe their data, that they were able to shut down and turn the curve pretty quickly. So it seems like their cases started at the end of January, around the 22nd. And within a month, their curve had flattened. Right. And they're a population 4 times bigger than the US. Whereas us, we've been going on for a month and a half and it's still rising. So shutting down the virus is really key to getting the economy started again. And they've been a lot more efficient at that than we have.
Right. One last question. We're going to wrap up in a second. I have a last question from someone on the call, on the audience, which is, how might the pandemic affect China's Belt and Road Initiative, this is of course its big program of investing in infrastructure around many parts of the world as a way of building its own economic influence. How do you think that might be affected?
I think they're going to have to put that on hold. And the countries that they've interacted with in that enterprise, they're financially, they're not in good shape. Most of them are lower income economies, and the coronavirus is going to hit them eventually, and I think it'll be much more severe than it is for us. So I think that thing is on hold for a couple of years at least.
Okay, good, thank you. Well, I think we're out of time, but Nelson, thank you very, very much for joining us. And if you're watching on the call, thank you also for joining us. Please come back to our site to see about the next episodes of Radio Corona on technologyreview.com. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, The Coronavirus Tech Report. See you next time. Thanks a lot.